morning. I'm Matt Driskill, editor of Asian Aviation Magazine and AsianAviation.com. Today we're in conversation with Stefano Baronci, which I hope I pronounced correctly, the Director General of the Asia-Pacific region of Airports Council International, which is a main trade group for airports around the world. Stefano, welcome to In Conversation.
Thank you very much, Matt, and thank you for having me in representation of more than 600 airports in Asia-Pacific.
Stefano, as everybody in aviation knows, the industry is in a crisis, the world's in a crisis. Planes are grounded, airports are turning into ghost towns, airport retailers are closing down. Changi Airport just closed another terminal, its newest one, Terminal 4, the other day. And of course, we can't forget the people that have lost their lives to COVID-19. Give us sort of your big picture outlook, if you will, about the Asia-Pacific region, not just in airport terms, but for the industry as a whole, and then we'll start dealing with the airports specifically.
Yes, well, there is a movie that was directed by Sergio Leone in 1966. It's an epic spaghetti western called The Good, the Bad, and the Ugly. It became a very real cult movie. I think the title of the movie perfectly represents what Asia Pacific and the sector, the aviation sector, has experienced over the last times. So we had 10 years of bonanza. It was the good. Asia Pacific contributed in terms of passenger growth globally by 45%. And then just in January up to March, we learned about the bad. The bad is something that the region has started to know first globally. And more than 300 million passengers were basically wiped out at airports. And revenues were also wiped out, because we don't have to forget that a passenger lost by an airline is a passenger lost by an airport. So more than 5 billion revenues in terms of aeronautical and commercial income is no longer there. And of course, we have to live with this situation. And what we have to face now, we are pretty sure, is what we could call the ugly. So from April up to June, ACI forecast that airports, airlines, and the sector overall will have to face the critical time, the most challenging time, which may mean doubling this loss, even more than doubling it. ACI forecast more than 700 million passengers that will be missing at Asia-Pacific airports. More than 11 billion US dollars also missing. If we try to go farther up to the end of the year, so by the end of 2020, despite the difficulties and complexity of forecasting it, we could envisage that at least 50% of traffic will be lost, that almost 29 billion US dollar will be lost. And unfortunately, when we say that we lose revenues, we are not in a position to say that we will reduce cost by the same extent, because airports still service debt. They are capital-intensive businesses. They have to stay open. They have to welcome cargo. They have to welcome repatriation flights. And they have to still serve the communities. They have to stay open. So even parking aircraft on the runway, on the air apron, or on the taxiways, depending on the numbers of aircraft, will require maintenance, something that, of course, we could not envisage. So to end, just to stay with the image of the movie, as much as the setting of that movie was the desert, here it's a valley of uncertainty that we have to face. And this is a territory that is still uncharted for many of our members.
I think the picture of the movie is great. I mean, it has been the good, the bad, and the ugly, and continues to be. And Sergio Leone was, I think that was actually Clint Eastwood's first spaghetti western, if I'm not.
Clint Eastwood. Yeah.
Let's deal with Asia Pacific now. You mentioned ACI Asia Pacific. Talked a while ago. I think you issued a statement that basically said the region's airports had hit rock bottom. Recently, we've seen carriers, Cathay, Singapore Air, they've cut 96% of their capacities. The borders remain closed. Quarantines are in effect. We're seeing a little bit of pickup in movement within China domestically, some in South Korea. Australia still has domestic traffic. So markets with domestic traffic, there seems to be a slight uptick. Do you see things looking up, or do you see any kind of pickup in traffic that will help airports put a little bit of lipstick on the ugly?
Yeah, I share your view when you say, Matt, that there are some spots of hopes or signals of hopes, because we see that there are several states that have been able to flattening the curve of transmission. So countries like China, Australia, New Zealand, and even Hong Kong, where I'm talking from, have been very, very good in controlling the transmission of the disease. At the same time, countries like China and to some extent the Republic of Korea, South Korea, are both showing an increase in terms of domestic traffic. The latest figures shows that about 47% of domestic traffic has been recovered by China, and about 26% in South Korea. Now, we have to be careful, of course, when we read and interpret this data, because the passengers that are using these flights are passengers that are moving back to where they work, moving back to their families. So it is not the discretionary travel profile that is involved. We will still have to assess what will happen in approximately a month to understand if this trend continues, also enlarging to leisure passengers. In addition to this, the profile of the region is mainly composed of domestic traffic. So on average, 67% of the total traffic is domestic. And we have countries such as China, India, Japan, Indonesia, and Australia, where domestic traffic plays a very important role. And finally, I think another positive point is that the seasonality of traffic in Asia Pacific is not exactly the ones that Europe and North America have. So the level of seasonality is probably lower, and we may not have this kind of lost summer that Europe and North America will have to face. So those are important spots. We have to prepare for restarting. We have to prepare for recovering. But this will very much depend on the capacity of states to take the fundamental decision of relaxing travel restrictions. We just heard yesterday that Thailand has decided to extend the travel restriction to the end of June. So again, it's moving into the ugly territory, as I said at the beginning. Certainly, if the process will be managed in the same way it started, meaning states moving independently, tourism and air transport will be one of the key sectors to suffer the most.
That kind of leads into my next question a little bit. again, ACI said in a statement that the freedom of movement will have to coexist with the virus until a vaccine is available at global scale, is found. Early on, give you a quick example, IATA had issued a call for blanket slot relief. ACI said, well, maybe it should be on a case-by-case basis. And so there was a bit of a, let's call it a friendly disagreement over slot relief. ICAO has only recently set up a coronavirus task force. I mean, do you see trade groups like yourself, like ACI, IATA, ICAO, are these groups coming together now? Is there someone leading coordinating the effort to help not just airports but the industry in general?
I think that we must do more, and we are doing more. We must do more because as an industry, as a sector that belongs to tourism more generally, we need to provide options and possibly solutions to policymakers to take the right decision. The decision, the inputs that we provide are strictly intertwined with the assessment that will have to be made by competent authorities such as the health ministers' authorities. So IATA and ACI are working closely. When you refer about slots, I'm confident that the discussion will move forward in looking for the right alignment. We set the basis to do so because since last year we reformed the governance, and now airports, airlines, and slot coordinators work together to review the global slot allocation systems. So this is just an example to say that the more we communicate and the more we act quickly, the better. If you ask me, I think that this will have to be led globally. We have to go beyond the local or bilateral discussions. Those are solutions that have to be found for common problems.
Earlier, again, all the trade groups, ACI, IATA, et cetera, have been calling on governments, as we've discussed, to provide aid to the industry. Airports specifically, I know Hong Kong has done some things there where I think they actually, even for ground handling companies and things like that, they offered to buy their equipment from them, or they put together an aid package for the airport. Changi is trying to help somewhat. Do you see airports getting help like the airlines have been getting in places like Australia or Cambodia or Indonesia or Vietnam, where, as you said, I mean, airports have these huge fixed costs. They can't shut down. And tourism, you know, Cambodia is probably a ghost country now because nobody's going to. I love going to Cambodia, but, you know, you can't go there now. But do you see the government stepping up with aid for airports like they have for airlines?
Well, I don't envy the governments at this time because they have to take critical decisions. I don't envy them because, of course, they will have to look. They have to look horizontally. So it's not just tourism; it's also many other sectors. But when we look at the figures again, we see that tourism, air transport are critical. They play a very strategic role, especially if we look ahead at the recovery phase. When we talk about aid, of course, some difficult decision will have to be taken. And what we experience at the moment is if some resources or if some reforms have been allocated is mainly in favor of airlines, not in favor of airports. Airports has actually tried as much as possible, depended also on their liquidity situation, to assist their customers, including airlines. But if you ask me if airports have received some kinds of funds, or we cannot count so many examples in the region. Now, there are ways, or let's say more practical ways to help airports as well. And of course, those have to do with waiving, for example, the concession fee, or proposing some soft loans to finance the future. This will depend very much on the situation at each country. But I think one principle is important, that no measure should be discriminatory, and as much as possible, the state should look holistically at the sector.
Well, and that's interesting. I mean, from a media standpoint, it's the airlines and the manufacturers that really are getting all the attention, like Boeing, Airbus, Qantas, Virgin Australia, Flybe in the UK, in Europe, that went Chapter 11, or the European equivalent of Chapter 11 bankruptcy. And airports seem sort of kind of forgotten in the mix to me. I mean, especially in the media.
Yeah, I mean, we have to consider that most of the airports are public in Asia-Pacific. And there are, of course, some exceptions, for example, in India, where the PPP has been introduced now several years ago. And it's also quite of a news that the Indian government has decided to go for further privatizations, despite the fact that this is probably not the easiest way to set a bid. But that being said, I think that what governments have tried to do is try to look at airports as an infrastructure that can support the economy. And now, airports are business in their own right, so they have to generate revenues. And what we try to advocate as much as possible is that we will have to continue to the user base to base our model of financing on the user base principle. So revenues will be generated by welcoming passengers, by making sure that these passengers spend at consumer shops. And of course, a critical point that will have to be clarified is who is responsible for what in terms of additional service to be provided, and of course, who bear the cost for these services. There are services that, in our view, and here we are perfectly aligned with the airlines, have to be provided by competent authorities. And we are not competent, for example, for the health screening of passengers, or even for dealing with passengers that are detected to be positive.
Yeah, I want to get to that in a little bit, because I think that's very, very interesting. I'm going to skip around a little bit. We talked about the revenues and the passengers that could be lost when you first came on the show. This is kind of a bit of a long question, so bear with me. We all know that air travel is it's an economic driver. It's good it's made the world a more connected place. You can get on a plane. For me, I'm from Oklahoma in the United States, and I live in Singapore. It takes me 24 hours to get there, but 24 hours on a plane is not exactly a fun thing. But I can be there in a day and see my family and all that, except I can't go right now because of all the lockdowns that are in place. Given the backlash recently with things like flight shaming in Europe, people have criticized Corsia. Airports take up a lot of space. And do you think that, because everybody's saying that the new normal is going to be a smaller industry, fewer flights, fewer routes, maybe more expensive because tickets are going to have to go up because social distancing measures, things like that. I mean, do we need more airports in the world, or is that something that people are thinking about now? Is it maybe we don't need to put this airport there?
Yeah, it's a it's a very good question. And I think that this depends on how you interpret this transition. So this phase that we are experiencing. My view of looking at the problem is that this represents a cycle that will have a start and an end. And so the question is, how long will it take to get to the end? But as soon as we approach to the level of normalization, to the end of the cycle, two main problems will be critical to be sorted out. One is the capacity crunch. Airports, the level of congestion is very much relevant and compelling in Asia-Pacific. We estimated that out of the 37 super congested airports worldwide, a kind of a Heathrow case, 20 are located in Asia-Pacific. If we look at the size of the mega cities in Asia, we see that in most of them, Jakarta, Manila, Delhi, Beijing until sometime 2 years ago, Manila, so most of them are super congested. And that there are plans to build, there is a need to build new airports. So if we don't want to live in an eternal catch-up mode, we have to plan for the future. And we have to do it in a sustainable way. Another important aspect is that the propensity to fly in China or in India, which are two key aviation markets, is still very low compared to the country where you come from. So for 100 people in the US, there are 200 flights that are taken per year, and it's much less, way less in India, 6 flights only every 100 people. So we can't avoid the fact that people will continue to fly. And we can't avoid it for the simple reason that there is no level of substitution to move people and cargo. So we can't actually benefit from what you have in Europe, where the intra-EU market can identify some level of substitution through high-speed train. So if you ask me, I still think that beyond the normalization phase, what we have to do is certainly to build more, but to build it in a sustainable way. So this is a challenge, and this is the challenge where we have also to continue to invest more. You must have heard from your fellow colleagues that one of the challenge will be very much to regain the confidence of the passenger. Regaining the confidence of the passengers also means comforting the passenger, which is environmentally sensitive. So airports and airlines have a role to play, and I think that airports in this respect have done a lot. The carbon accreditation program is an example, and airports such as Delhi is excelling in this respect.
I'm going to combine a couple of questions here that I had for you. I'm sure you, like me, and everybody else in the industry, we're all watching these webinars that have sprung up all over the place. And you and I are in conversation here via Skype. You're in Hong Kong, I'm in Singapore. This is never going to replace getting on a plane and having a face-to-face meeting, especially when you're trying to seal a deal either for a new airport store or something like that. But reading history, well, everybody says in these webinars that aviation will be changed forever. I'm cynical. That's just because I'm older and I've been a journalist for too long. Humankind seems to have a bit of a short collective memory. We had the Black Death in Europe in the Middle Ages, killed a third of the European population. We had the Spanish flu in the 1918. We had SARS in Hong Kong. We had MERS in the Middle East. We've had bird flu. Airports and airplanes, I mean, are made to move people, and right now with social distancing, that's going to be very hard. And it's sort of a two-part question. One, you see airlines like Emirates actually, before people even check in, they're giving them COVID-19 tests at the airport.
Mm.
Is that something that airports around in Asia Pacific are going to have to follow at some point? Who's going to pay for that? Is it the passenger ultimately? Will it be the airports? Will it be the governments? And then sort of the second one is, I actually remembered when I started flying overseas, one of my first postings was to Sri Lanka, and this was back in 1989, and I had to get my vaccine card. It was one of those old yellow cards that you used to carry, showing that you got vaccinated for yellow fever and any number of things. Are we going to have health passports at some point to even get in the airport?
Yeah, I mean, just to quote Paul Griffiths, the CEO of Dubai Airport, with his British sarcasm, he said some days ago that if we don't take the right decisions, flying and air transport in general may be as enjoyable as an open heart surgery.
I remember
that. So this means that measures will have to be certainly taken, added to the current way of processing passengers, both for airports and airlines, but more generally for any other modes of transport, for any other stakeholders. And if those measures are not practical, then we may agree with the statement from Paul Griffiths. If we had to purely respect the physical and social distancing, managing 400 passengers that normally fit into an average aircraft, jumbo jet, would mean setting a queue which is almost 1 kilometer long. So what I'm trying to say is that the measures that will have to be identified have to be practical and implementable. And most importantly, will have to be identified based on the assessment of the competent authorities. In risk-based, I said once that we will have to learn to coexist with the virus. I could also say that we have to learn to dance with the virus. Dancing means being able to understand what is the rhythm of the virus from an epidemiological perspective. So the steps we will have to follow the steps. And of course, we can play an important role in trying to limiting the transmission. But at the end of the day, measures will have to take into account that traffic will grow. And the more the traffic grows, the more we will have to look for alternative ways to get to an equivalent result in terms of mitigating the transmission. So if social distancing, purely speaking, a 2-meter distance from my partner may not be respected, then there are possibly other ways that can make sure to mitigate that risk.
I certainly don't want to make light of everything because, people have died, people continue to get sick, jobs have been lost, billions of dollars have been lost. I mean, it's a very serious subject. But if we have to dance with the virus, I'm dead, because if you just have to ask my wife what kind of a dancer I am, and she's just going to laugh. Stefano, I try to end these shows by asking if there's a bright spot. Again, we don't, it's tough to say, yeah, here's a bright spot, a good thing that's coming out of this. just because of the damage that's been done around the world to airports, to airlines, to the MRO shops when they get shut down because somebody tested positive, to the hundreds of thousands of people who have already lost their lives. It's a serious subject. We know that, but I'm just curious if I'm an airport operator, is there a bright spot to this whole thing that I can look forward to?
Yeah, I think there are certainly some bright spots, and we had to learn, and we will continue to learn from this dramatic phase and from this dramatic challenge. The first bright spot, in my opinion, is that people are learning to become more adaptable, to adjust to new challenges. I think it is a great skill, and it will serve different purposes in multiple areas, even when we will be able to overcome this problem. The other point is that it will hopefully be a way for regulators to accelerate some reforms that may make the process of managing the passenger journey smarter. So a contactless concept is already supported by IT devices. It's just a matter to make sure that legislation is up to the task. And finally, I think that another important point is in an era of protectionism and nationalism, what is happening now is experiencing a virus which is extremely democratic. It concerns all of us, and it's probably bringing us back to what Thomas Friedman was advocating at the beginning of this century, that the world is flat, and that there is a lot that we can do that should and could be applied globally. If we don't do so, my expectation is that the social and economic consequences will be even more deadly than COVID-19 per se.
Stefano Baronci, Director General of ACI Asia-Pacific, thanks for joining me in conversation.
Thank you very much, Matt.